This is Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, Volume 2 of 3, a work now in the public domain. Chapter 26. Atonus forthe unpoliteness, of a former chapter, which deserted most unceremoniously. A. It would be by no means seemly in an humble author to keep so mighty a personage as a beadle waiting with his back to the fire, and the skirts of his coat gathered up under his arms, until such time as it might suit his pleasure to relieve him, and as it would still less become his station, or his gallantry. To involve in the same neglect a lady on whom that beadle had looked with an eye of tenderness and affection, and in whose ear he had whispered sweet words, which, coming from such a quarter, might well thrill the bosom of maid or matron of whatsoever degree. The faithful historian whose pen traces these words, trusting that he knows his place, and entertains a becoming reverence for those upon earth to whom high and important authority is delegated, hastens to pay them that respect which their position demands, and to treat them with all that duteous ceremony which their exalted rank and, by consequence, great virtues imperatively claim at his hands. Towards this end, indeed, he had purposed to introduce in this place a dissertation touching the divine right of beadles, and elucidative of the position, that a beadle can do no wrong, which could not fail to have been both pleasurable and profitable to the right-minded reader, but which he is unfortunately compelled, by want of time and space, to postpone to some more convenient and fitting opportunity, on the arrival of which he will be prepared to show that a beadle properly constituted, that is to say, a parochial beadle, attached to a parochial workhouse, and attending in his official capacity the parochial church, is, in right and virtue of his office, possessed of all the excellencies and best qualities of humanity, and that to none of those excellencies can mere company's beadles, or court of law beadles, or even chapel of ease beadles, save the last, and they in a very lowly and inferior degree, lay the remotest sustainable claim. Mr. Bumble had recounted the teaspoons, reweighed the sugar tongs, made a closer inspection of the milk pot, and ascertained to a nicety the exact condition of the furniture down to the very horsehair seats of the chairs, and had repeated each process full half a dozen times, before he began to think that it was time for Mrs. Corney to return. Thinking begets thinking, and, as there were no sounds of Mrs. Corney's approach, it occurred to Mr. Bumble that it would be an innocent and virtuous way of spending the time if he were further to allay his curiosity by a cursory glance at the interior of Mrs. Corney's chest of drawers. Having listened at the keyhole to assure himself that nobody was approaching the chamber, Mr. Bumble, beginning at the bottom, proceeded to make himself acquainted with the contents of the 3 long drawers, which, being filled with various garments of good fashion and texture, carefully preserved between 2 layers of old newspapers, speckled with dried lavender, seemed to yield him exceeding satisfaction. Arriving, in course of time, at the right-hand corner drawer, in which was the key, and beholding therein a small padlocked box, which, being shaken, gave forth a pleasant sound, as of the chinking of coin, Mr. Bumble returned with a stately walk to the fireplace, and, resuming his old attitude, said, with a grave and determined air, "I'll do it." He followed up this remarkable declaration by shaking his head in a waggish manner for 10 minutes, as though he were remonstrating with himself for being such a pleasant dog, and then took a view of his legs in profile with much seeming pleasure and interest. He was still placidly engaged in this latter survey, when Mrs. Corney, hurrying into the room, threw herself, in a breathless state, on a chair by the fireside, and covering her eyes with one hand, placed the other over her heart, and gasped for breath. "Mrs. Corney," said Mr. Bumble, stooping over the matron. "What is this, ma'am?" "Has anything happened, ma'am? Pray answer me. I'm on." "On." Mr. Bumble, in his alarm, could not immediately think of the word tenterhooks, so he said, "broken bottles." "Oh, Mr. Bumble," cried the lady, "I have been so dreadfully put out." "Put out, ma'am?" exclaimed Mr. Bumble. "Who has dared to?" "I know," said Mr. Bumble, checking himself, with native majesty. "This is them wicious paupers." "It's dreadful to think of," said the lady, shuddering. "Then don't think of it, ma'am," rejoined Mr. Bumble. "I can't help it," whimpered the lady. "Then take something, ma'am," said Mr. Bumble soothingly. "A little of the wine." "Not for the world," replied Mrs. Corney. "I couldn't. Oh, the top shelf in the right-hand corner. Oh!" Uttering these words, the good lady pointed distractedly to the cupboard and underwent a convulsion from internal spasms. Mr. Bumble rushed to the closet and, snatching a pint green glass bottle from the shelf, thus incoherently indicated, filled a teacup with its contents and held it to the lady's lips. "I'm better now," said Mrs. Corney, falling back, after drinking half of it. Mr. Bumble raised his eyes piously to the ceiling in thankfulness, and, bringing them down again to the brim of the cup, lifted it to his nose. "Peppermint," explained Mrs. Corney in a faint voice, smiling gently on the beadle as she spoke. "Try it. There's a little something else in it." Mr. Bumble tasted the medicine with a doubtful look, smacked his lips, took another taste, and put the cup down empty. "It is very comforting," said Mrs. Corney. "Very much so indeed, ma'am," said the beadle. As he spoke, he drew a chair beside the matron, and tenderly inquired what had happened to distress her. "Nothing," replied Mrs. Corney. "I am a foolish, excitable, weak creature." "Not weak, ma'am," retorted Mr. Bumble, drawing his chair a little closer. "Are you a weak creature, Mrs. Corney?" "We are all weak creatures," said Mrs. Corney, laying down a general principle. "So we are," said the beadle. Nothing was said on either side for a minute or two afterwards, and by the expiration of that time, Mr. Bumble had illustrated the position by removing his left arm from the back of Mrs. Corney's chair, where it had previously rested, to Mrs. Corney's apron string, round which it gradually became entwined. "We are all weak creatures," said Mr. Bumble. Mrs. Corney sighed. "Don't sigh, Mrs. Corney," said Mr. Bumble. "I can't help it," said Mrs. Corney. And she sighed again. "This is a very comfortable room, ma'am," said Mr. Bumble, looking round. "Another room and this, ma'am, would be a complete thing." "It would be too much for one," murmured the lady. "And not for two, ma'am," rejoined Mr. Bumble, in soft accents. "Eh, Mrs. Corney?" Mrs. Corney drooped her head when the beadle said this, and the beadle drooped his to get a view of Mrs. Corney's face. Mrs. Corney, with great propriety, turned her head away and released her hand to get at her pocket-handkerchief, but insensibly replaced it in that of Mr. Bumble. "The board allow you coals, don't they, Mrs. Corney?" inquired the beadle, affectionately pressing her hand. "And candles," replied Mrs. Corney, slightly returning the pressure. "Coals, candles, and house rent free," said Mr. Bumble. "Oh, Mrs. Corney, what an angel you are!" The lady was not proof against this burst of feeling. She sunk into Mr. Bumble's arms, and that gentleman, in his agitation, imprinted a passionate kiss upon her chaste nose. "Such parochial perfection!" exclaimed Mr. Bumble rapturously. "You know that Mr. Slout is worse tonight, my fascinator?" "Yes," replied Mrs. Corney bashfully. "He can't live a week, the doctor says," pursued Mr. Bumble. "He is the master of this establishment. His death will cause a vacancy. That vacancy must be filled up. Oh, Mrs. Corney, what a prospect this opens! What an opportunity for a joining of hearts and housekeeping!" Mrs. Corney sobbed. "The little word," said Mr. Bumble, bending over the bashful beauty. "The one little word, my blessed Corney." Yes," sighed out the matron. "One more," pursued the beadle. "Compose your darling feelings for only one more. When is it to come off?" Mrs. Corney twice essayed to speak, and twice failed. At length, summoning up courage, she threw her arms round Mr. Bumble's neck and said it might be as soon as ever he pleased, and that he was an irresistible duck. Matters being thus amicably and satisfactorily arranged, the contract was solemnly ratified in another teacupful of the peppermint mixture, which was rendered the more necessary by the flutter and agitation of the lady's spirits. While it was being disposed of, she acquainted Mr. Bumble with the old woman's decease. "Very good," said that gentleman, sipping his peppermint. "I'll call at Sowerberry's as I go home, and tell him to send tomorrow morning. Was it that has frightened you, love?" "It wasn't anything particular, dear," said the lady evasively. "It must have been something, love," urged Mr. Bumble. "Want to tell your own bee?" "Not now," rejoined the lady. "One of these days, after we're married, dear." "After we're married!" exclaimed Mr. Bumble. "It wasn't any impudence from any of them male paupers, as—" No, love," interposed the lady hastily. "If I thought it was," continued Mr. Bumble, "if I thought any one of 'em had dared to lift his vulgar eyes to that lovely countenance—" "They wouldn't have dared to do it, love," responded the lady. "They had better not," said Mr. Bumble, clenching his fist. "Let me see any man, parochial or extra-parochial, as would presume to do it, and I can tell him that he wouldn't do it a second time. Unembellished by any violence of gesticulation, this might have sounded as no very high compliment to the lady's charms, but, as Mr. Bumble accompanied the threat with many warlike gestures, she was much touched with this proof of his devotion, and protested, with great admiration, that he was indeed a dove. The dove then turned up his coat collar and put on his cocked hat, and having exchanged a long and affectionate embrace with his future partner, once again braved the cold wind of the night, merely pausing for a few minutes in the male paupers' ward to abuse them a little, with the view of satisfying himself that he could fill the office of workhouse master with needful acerbity. Assured of his qualifications, Mr. Bumble left the building with a light heart and bright visions of his future promotion, which served to occupy his mind until he reached the shop of the undertaker. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Sowerberry having gone out to tea and supper, and Noah Claypole not being at any time disposed to take upon himself a greater amount of physical exertion than is necessary to a convenient performance of the two functions of eating and drinking, the shop was not closed, although it was past the usual hour of shutting up. Mr. Bumble tapped with his cane on the counter several times, but, attracting no attention, and beholding a light shining through the glass window of the little parlour at the back of the shop, he made bold to peep in and see what was going forward, and, when he saw what was going forward, he was not a little surprised. The cloth was laid for supper, and the table was covered with bread and butter, plates and glasses, a porter-pot, and a wine-bottle. At the upper end of the table, Mr. Noah Claypole lolled negligently in an easy-chair, with his legs thrown over one of the arms, an open clasp knife in one hand, and a mass of buttered bread in the other. Close beside him stood Charlotte, opening oysters from a barrel, which Mr. Claypole condescended to swallow with remarkable avidity. A more than ordinary redness in the region of the young gentleman's nose, and a kind of fixed wink in his right eye, denoted that he was in a slight degree intoxicated, and these symptoms were confirmed by the intense relish with which he took his oysters, for which nothing but a strong appreciation of their cooling properties, in cases of internal fever, could have sufficiently accounted. "Here's a delicious fat one, Noah, dear," said Charlotte. "Try him, do, only this one." "What a delicious thing is a oyster," remarked Mr. Claypole after he had swallowed it. "What a pity it is. A number of 'em should ever make you feel uncomfortable, isn't it, Charlotte?" "It's quite a cruelty," said Charlotte. "So it is," acquiesced Mr. Claypole. "Aren't you fond of oysters?" "Not over much," replied Charlotte. "I like to see you eat 'em, Noah dear, better than eating them myself." "Law," said Noah reflectively. "How queer. Have another," said Charlotte. "Here's one with such a beautiful, delicate beard." "I can't manage any more," said Noah. "I'm very sorry. Come here, Charlotte, and I'll kiss you." "What?" said Mr. Bumble, bursting into the room. "Say that again, sir." Charlotte uttered a scream and hid her face in her apron, while Mr. Claypole, without making any further change in his position and suffering his legs to reach the ground, gazed at the beadle in drunken terror. "Say it again, you vile, audacious fellow," said Mr. Bumble. "How dare you mention such a thing, sir, and how dare you encourage him, you insolent minx? Kiss her!" exclaimed Mr. Bumble in strong indignation. "Faugh!" "I didn't mean to do it," said Noah, blubbering. "She's always a-kissing of me whether I like it or not." "Oh, Noah!" cried Charlotte reproachfully. "You are, you know you are," retorted Noah. "She's always a-doing of it, Mr. Bumble, sir. She chucks me under the chin, please, sir, and makes all manner of love." "Silence!" cried Mr. Bumble sternly. "Take yourself downstairs, ma'am. Noah, you shut up the shop and say another word till your master comes home at your peril, and, when he does come home, tell him that Mr. Bumble said he was to send a old woman's shell after breakfast tomorrow morning. Do you hear, sir?" "Kissing," cried Mr. Bumble, holding up his hands. "The sin and wickedness of the lower orders in this parochial district is frightful. If Parliament don't take their abominable courses under consideration, this country's ruined, and the character of the peasantry gone for ever." With these words, the beadle strode, with a lofty and gloomy air, from the undertaker's premises. And now that we have accompanied him so far on his road home, and have made all necessary preparations for the old woman's funeral, let us set on foot a few inquiries after young Oliver Twist, and ascertain whether he be still lying in the ditch where Toby Crackit left him. Chapter 28. And looks after Oliver. A.N.D. proceeds W.I.H.H.H.'s adventures. "Wolves tear your throats," muttered Sikes, grinding his teeth. "I wish I was among some of you. You'd howl the hoarser for it." As Sikes growled forth this imprecation, with the most desperate ferocity that his desperate nature was capable of, he rested the body of the wounded boy across his bended knee and turned his head for an instant to look back at his pursuers. There was little to be made out in the mist and darkness, but the loud shouting of men vibrated through the air, and the barking of the neighbouring dogs, roused by the sound of the alarm bell, resounded in every direction. "Stop, you white-livered hound!" cried the robber, shouting after Toby Crackit, who, making the best use of his long legs, was already ahead. "Stop!" The repetition of the word brought Toby to a dead stand, still, for he was not quite satisfied that he was beyond the range of pistol shot, and Sikes was in no mood to be played with. "Bear a hand with the boy," roared Sikes, beckoning furiously to his confederate. "Come back!" Toby made a show of returning, but ventured, in a low voice, broken for want of breath, to intimate considerable reluctance as he came slowly along. "Quicker!" cried Sikes, laying the boy in a dry ditch at his feet, and drawing a pistol from his pocket. "Don't play the booby with me." At this moment the noise grew louder, and Sikes, again looking round, could discern that the men who had given chase were already climbing the gate of the field in which he stood, and that a couple of dogs were some paces in advance of them. "It's all up, Bill," cried Toby. "Drop the kid and show him your heels." With this parting advice, Mr. Crackit, preferring the chance of being shot by his friend to the certainty of being taken by his enemies, fairly turned tail and darted off at full speed. Sikes clenched his teeth, took one look round, threw over the prostrate form of Oliver the cape in which he had been hurriedly muffled, ran along the front of the hedge as if to distract the attention of those behind from the spot where the boy lay, paused for a second before another hedge which met it at right angles, and whirling his pistol high into the air, cleared it at a bound, and was gone. "Ho, ho, there!" cried a tremulous voice in the rear. "Pincher, Neptune, come here, come here!" The dogs, which, in common with their masters, seemed to have no particular relish for the sport in which they were engaged, readily answered to this command, and 3 men, who had by this time advanced some distance into the field, stopped to take counsel together. "My advice, or, leastways, I should say, my orders, is," said the fattest man of the party, "that we immediately go home again." "I am agreeable to anything which is agreeable to Mr. Giles," said a shorter man, who was by no means of a slim figure, and who was very pale in the face and very polite, as frightened men frequently are. "I shouldn't wish to appear ill-mannered, gentlemen," said the third, who had called the dogs back. "Mr. Giles ought to know." "Certainly," replied the shorter man, "and whatever Mr. Giles says, it isn't our place to contradict him." "No, no, I know my situation. Thank my stars, I know my situation." To tell the truth, the little man did seem to know his situation, and to know perfectly well that it was by no means a desirable one, for his teeth chattered in his head as he spoke. "You are afraid, Brittles," said Mr. Giles. "I aren't," said Brittles. "You are," said Giles. "You're a falsehood, Mr. Giles," said Brittles. "You're a lie, Brittles," said Mr. Giles. Now, these 4 retorts arose from Mr. Giles's taunt, and Mr. Giles's taunt had arisen from his indignation at having the responsibility of going home again imposed upon himself under cover of a compliment. The third man brought the dispute to a close most philosophically. "I'll tell you what it is, gentlemen," said he, "we're all afraid." "Speak for yourself, sir," said Mr. Giles, who was the palest of the party. "So I do," replied the man. "It's natural and proper to be afraid under such circumstances." "I am. So am I," said Brittles, "only there's no call to tell a man he is so bounceably." These frank admissions softened Mr. Giles, who at once owned that he was afraid, upon which they all 3 faced about and ran back again with the completest unanimity, till Mr. Giles, who had the shortest wind of the party, and was encumbered with a pitchfork, most handsomely insisted upon stopping to make an apology for his hastiness of speech. "But it's wonderful," said Mr. Giles when he had explained, "what a man will do when his blood is up. I should have committed murder, I know I should, if we'd caught one of the rascals." As the other 2 were impressed with a similar presentiment, and their blood, like his, had all gone down again, some speculation ensued upon the cause of this sudden change in their temperament. "I know what it was," said Mr. Giles. "It was the gate." "I shouldn't wonder if it was," exclaimed Brittles, catching at the idea. "You may depend upon it," said Giles, that gate stopped the flow of the excitement." I felt all mine suddenly going away as I was climbing over it. By a remarkable coincidence. The other 2 had been visited with the same unpleasant sensation at that precise moment, so that it was quite conclusive that it was the gate, especially as there was no doubt regarding the time at which the change had taken place, because all three remembered that they had come in sight of the robbers at the very instant of its occurrence. This dialogue was held between the two men who had surprised the burglars, and a travelling tinker, who had been sleeping in an outhouse, and who had been roused, together with his two mongrel curs, to join in the pursuit. Mr. Giles acted in the double capacity of butler and steward to the old lady of the mansion, and Brittles was a lad of all work, who, having entered her service a mere child, was treated as a promising young boy still, though he was something past 30. Encouraging each other with such converse as this, but keeping very close together notwithstanding, and looking apprehensively round whenever a fresh gust rattled through the boughs, the three men hurried back to a tree behind which they had left their lantern, lest its light should inform the thieves in what direction to fire. Catching up the light, they made the best of their way home, at a good round trot, and long after their dusky forms had ceased to be discernible, it might have been seen twinkling and dancing in the distance, like some exhalation of the damp and gloomy atmosphere through which it was swiftly borne. The air grew colder as day came slowly on, and the mist rolled along the ground like a dense cloud of smoke. The grass was wet, the pathways and low places were all mire and water, and the damp breath of an unwholesome wind went languidly by with a hollow moaning. Still Oliver lay motionless and insensible on the spot where Sikes had left him. Morning drew on apace. The air became more sharp and piercing as its first dull hue, the death of night rather than the birth of day, glimmered faintly in the sky. The objects which had looked dim and terrible in the darkness grew more and more defined, and gradually resolved into their familiar shapes. The rain came down thick and fast, and pattered noisily among the leafless bushes. And Oliver felt it not, as it beat against him, for he still lay stretched, helpless and unconscious, on his bed of clay. At length, a low cry of pain broke the stillness that prevailed, and uttering it, the boy awoke. His left arm, rudely bandaged in a shawl, hung heavy and useless at his side, and the bandage was saturated with blood. He was so weak that he could scarcely raise himself into a sitting posture, and when he had done so, he looked feebly round for help and groaned with pain. Trembling in every joint, from cold and exhaustion, he made an effort to stand upright, but, shuddering from head to foot, fell prostrate on the ground. After a short return of the stupor in which he had been so long plunged, Oliver, urged by a creeping sickness at his heart, which seemed to warn him that if he lay there he must surely die, got upon his feet and essayed to walk. His head was dizzy, and he staggered to and fro like a drunken man. But he kept up nevertheless, and, with his head drooping languidly on his breast, went stumbling onward, he knew not whither. And now hosts of bewildering and confused ideas came crowding on his mind. He seemed to be still walking between Sikes and Crackit, who were angrily disputing, for the very words they said sounded in his ears, and when he caught his own attention, as it were, by making some violent effort to save himself from falling, he found that he was talking to them. Then he was alone with Sikes, plodding on as they had done the previous day, and as shadowy people passed them by, he felt the robber's grasp upon his wrist. Suddenly he started back at the report of firearms, and there rose into the air loud cries and shouts. Lights gleamed before his eyes, and all was noise and tumult, as some unseen hand bore him hurriedly away. Through all these rapid visions there ran an undefined, uneasy consciousness of pain, which wearied and tormented him incessantly. Thus he staggered on, creeping almost mechanically between the bars of gates or through hedge gaps as they came in his way until he reached a road, and here the rain began to fall so heavily that it roused him. He looked about, and saw that at no great distance there was a house, which perhaps he could reach. Seeing his condition, they might have compassion on him, and if they did not, it would be better, he thought, to die near human beings than in the lonely open fields. He summoned up all his strength for one last trial, and bent his faltering steps towards it. As he drew nearer to this house, a feeling came over him that he had seen it before. He remembered nothing of its details, but the shape and aspect of the building seemed familiar to him. That garden wall! On the grass inside he had fallen on his knees last night and prayed the two men's mercy. It was the very same house they had attempted to rob. Oliver felt such fear come over him when he recognized the place that, for the instant, he forgot the agony of his wound and thought only of flight. Flight! He could scarcely stand, and if he were in full possession of all the best powers of his slight and youthful frame, where could he fly to? He pushed against the garden gate. It was unlocked, and swung open on its hinges. He tottered across the lawn, climbed the steps, knocked faintly at the door, and his whole strength failing him, sunk down against one of the pillars of the little portico. It happened that, about this time, Mr. Giles, Brittles, and the tinker were recruiting themselves after the fatigues and terrors of the night with tea and sundries in the kitchen. Not that it was Mr. Giles's habit to admit to too great familiarity the humbler servants, towards whom it was rather his wont to deport himself with a lofty affability, which, while it gratified, could not fail to remind them of his superior position in society. But death, fires, and burglary make all men equals, and Mr. Giles sat with his legs stretched out before the kitchen fender, leaning his left arm on the table, while with his right he illustrated a circumstantial and minute account of the robbery, to which his hearers, but especially the cook and housemaid, who were of the party, listened with breathless interest. "It was about 2:30, said Mr. Giles, "or I wouldn't swear that it might have been a little nearer 3 when I woke up, and turning round in my bed, as it might be so." Here Mr. Giles turned round in his chair and pulled the corner of the tablecloth over him to imitate bedclothes. I fancied I heard a noise. At this point of the narrative, the cook turned pale, and asked the housemaid to shut the door, who asked Brittles, who asked the tinker, who pretended not to hear. "Heard a noise," continued Mr. Giles. "I says at first this is illusion, and was composing myself off to sleep, when I heard the noise again, distinct." "What sort of a noise?" asked the cook. "A kind of a busting noise," replied Mr. Giles, looking round him. "More like the noise of powdering an iron bar on a nutmeg grater," suggested Brittle. "It was when you heard, sir," rejoined Mr. Giles, "but at this time it had a busting sound." "I turned down the clothes," continued Giles, rolling back the tablecloth, "sat up in bed and listened." The cook and housemaid simultaneously ejaculated, "Law!" and drew their chairs closer together. "I heard it now, quite apparent," resumed Mr. Giles. "Somebody," I says, "is forcing of a door or window. What's to be done?" "I'll call up that poor lad Brittles and save him from being murdered in his bed, or his throat," I says, "may be cut from his right ear to his left, without his ever knowing it." Here all eyes were turned upon Brittles, who fixed his upon the speaker and stared at him, with his mouth wide open and his face expressive of the most unmitigated horror. "I tossed off the clothes," said Giles, throwing away the tablecloth and looking very hard at the cook and housemaid, "got softly out of bed, drew on a pair of—" "Ladies present, Mr. Giles," murmured the tinker. "Of shoes, sir," said Giles, turning upon him and laying great emphasis on the word, "seized the loaded pistol that always goes upstairs with the plate basket, and walked on tiptoes to his room." "Brittles," I says, when I had woke him, "don't be frightened." "So you did," observed Brittles in a low voice. "We're dead men, I think, Brittles," I says, continued Giles, "but don't be under any alarm." "Was he frightened?" asked the cook. "Not a bit of it," replied Mr. Giles. "He was as firm, pretty near as firm as I was." "I should have died at once, I'm sure, if it had been me," observed the housemaid. "You're a woman," retorted Brittles, plucking up a little. "Brittles is right," said Mr. Giles, nodding his head approvingly. "From a woman nothing else was to be expected." We, being men, took a dark lantern that was standing on Brittles's hob and groped our way downstairs in the pitch dark, as it might be so. Mr. Giles had risen from his seat and taken 2 steps with his eyes shut to accompany his description with appropriate action, when he started violently, in common with the rest of the company, and hurried back to his chair. The cook and housemaid screamed. "It was a knock," said Mr. Giles, assuming perfect serenity. "Open the door, somebody." Nobody moved. "It seems a strange sort of thing, a knock coming at such a time in the morning," said Mr. Giles, surveying the pale faces which surrounded him and looking very blank himself. "But the door must be opened. Do you hear somebody?" Mr. Giles, as he spoke, looked at Brittles. But that young man, being naturally modest, probably considered himself nobody, and so held that the inquiry could not have any application to him. At all events, he tendered no reply. Mr. Giles directed an appealing glance at the tinker, but he had suddenly fallen asleep. The women were out of the question. "If Brittles would rather open the door in the presence of witnesses," said Mr. Giles, after a short silence, "I am ready to make one." "So am I," said the tinker, waking up as suddenly as he had fallen asleep. Brittles capitulated on these terms, and the party being somewhat reassured by the discovery, made on throwing open the shutters, that it was now broad day, took their way upstairs, with the dogs in front and the 2 women, who were afraid to stop below, bringing up the rear. By the advice of Mr. Giles, they all talked very loud to warn any evil-disposed person outside that they were strong in numbers, and by a master stroke of policy originating in the brain of the same ingenious gentleman, the dogs' tails were well pinched in the hall to make them bark savagely. These precautions having been taken, Mr. Giles held on fast by the tinker's arm, to prevent his running away, as he pleasantly said, and gave the word of command to open the door. Brittles obeyed, and the group, peeping timorously over each other's shoulders, beheld no more formidable object than poor little Oliver Twist, speechless and exhausted, who raised his heavy eyes and mutely solicited their compassion. "A boy!" exclaimed Mr. Giles, valiantly pushing the tinker into the background. "What's the matter with the— Why, Brittles, look here, don't you know?" Brittles, who had got behind the door to open it, no sooner saw Oliver than he uttered a loud cry. Mr. Giles, seizing the boy by one leg and one arm, fortunately not the broken limb, lugged him straight into the hall and deposited him at full length on the ground thereof. "Here he is," bawled Giles, calling, in a great state of excitement, up the staircase. "Here's one of the thieves, ma'am." "Here's a thief, miss, wounded, miss." I shot him, miss, and Brittles held the light. "In a lantern, miss," cried Brittles, applying one hand to the side of his mouth so that his voice might travel the better. The two women, servants, ran upstairs to carry the intelligence that Mr. Giles had captured a robber, and the tinker busied himself in endeavouring to restore Oliver, lest he should die before he could be hung. In the midst of all this noise and commotion, there was heard a sweet female voice which quelled it in an instant. "Giles," whispered the voice from the stairhead. "I'm here, miss," replied Mr. Giles. "Don't be frightened, miss, I ain't much injured. He didn't make a very desperate resistance, miss. I was soon too many for him." "Hush," replied the young lady. "You frightened my aunt as much as the thieves did." "Is the poor creature much hurt? Wounded desperate, miss," replied Giles with indescribable complacency. "He looks as if he was a-going, miss," bawled Brittles, in the same manner as before. "Wouldn't you like to come and look at him, miss, in case he should?" "Hush, pray, there's a good man," rejoined the young lady. "Wait quietly one instant, while I speak to aunt." With a footstep as soft and gentle as the voice, the speaker tripped away, and soon retained, with the direction that the wounded person was to be carried carefully upstairs to Mr. Giles's room, and that Brittles was to saddle the pony and betake himself instantly to Chertsey, from which place he was to dispatch, with all speed, a constable and doctor. "But won't you take one look at him first, miss?" asked Mr. Giles, with as much pride as if Oliver were some bird of rare plumage that he had skilfully brought down. "Not one little peep, miss. Not now for the world," replied the young lady. "Poor fellow! Oh! Treat him kindly, Giles, if it is only for my sake." The old servant looked up at the speaker as she turned away with a glance as proud and admiring as if she had been his own child. Then bending over Oliver, he helped to carry him upstairs with the care and solicitude of a woman. Chapter 29. HASAN Introductory Account OFTHA Inmates OFTHA House TO, which Oliver resorted. AND relates WHATHEY thought OFHIM. IN, a handsome room, though its furniture had rather the air of old-fashioned comfort than of modern elegance. There sat two ladies at a well-spread breakfast table. Mr. Giles, dressed with scrupulous care in a full suit of black, was in attendance upon them. He had taken his station some half-way between the sideboard and the breakfast table, and with his body drawn up to its full height, his head thrown back, and inclined the merest trifle on one side, his left leg advanced, and his right hand thrust into his waistcoat, while his left hung down by his side, grasping a waiter, looked like one who laboured under a very agreeable sense of his own merits and importance. Of the two ladies, one was well advanced in years, but the high-backed oaken chair in which she sat was not more upright than she. Dressed with the utmost nicety and precision, in a quaint mixture of bygone costume, with some slight concessions to the prevailing taste, which rather served to point the old style pleasantly than to impair its effect, she sat in a stately manner with her hands folded on the table before her, and her eyes, of which age had dimmed but little of their brightness, attentively fixed upon her young companion. The younger lady was in the lovely bloom and springtime of womanhood, at that age when, if ever angels be for God's good purposes enthroned in mortal forms, they may be, without impiety, supposed to abide in such as hers. She was not past 17. Cast in so slight and exquisite a mould, so mild and gentle, so pure and beautiful, that earth seemed not her element, nor its rough creatures her fit companions. The very intelligence that shone in her deep blue eye and was stamped upon her noble head seemed scarcely of her age or of the world. And yet the changing expression of sweetness and good humour, the thousand lights that played about the face and left no shadow there, above all, the smile, the cheerful, happy smile, were entwined with the best sympathies and affections of our nature. She was busily engaged in the little offices of the table, and chancing to raise her eyes as the elder lady was regarding her, playfully put back her hair, which was simply braided on her forehead, and threw into one beaming look such a gush of affection and artless loveliness that blessed spirits might have smiled to look upon her. The elder lady smiled, but her heart was full, and she brushed away a tear as she did so. "And Brittles has been gone upwards of an hour, has he?" asked the old lady, after a pause. "An hour and 12 minutes, ma'am," replied Mr. Giles, referring to a silver watch, which he drew forth by a black ribbon. "He is always slow," remarked the old lady. "Brittles always was a slow boy, ma'am," replied the attendant. And seeing, by the by, that Brittles had been a slow boy for upwards of 30 years, there appeared no great probability of his ever being a fast one. "He gets worse instead of better, I think," said the elder lady. "It is very inexcusable in him if he stops to play with any other boys," said the young lady, smiling. Mr. Giles was apparently considering the propriety of indulging in a respectful smile himself, when a gig drove up to the garden gate, out of which there jumped a fat gentleman, who ran straight up to the door, and getting quickly into the house by some mysterious process, burst into the room and nearly overturned Mr. Giles and the breakfast table together. "I never heard of such a thing," exclaimed the fat gentleman. "My dear Mrs. Maylie, bless my soul, in the silence of night too, I never heard of such a thing." With these expressions of condolence, the fat gentleman shook hands with both ladies, and drawing up a chair, inquired how they found themselves. "You ought to be dead, positively dead with the fright," said the fat gentleman. "Why didn't you send?" "Bless me, my man should have come in a minute, and so would I, and my assistant would have been delighted, or anybody, I'm sure, under such circumstances, dear, dear, so unexpected, in the silence of night too." The doctor seemed especially troubled by the fact of the robbery having been unexpected and attempted in the night time, as if it were the established custom of gentlemen in the housebreaking way to transact business at noon, and to make an appointment, by the twopenny post, a day or two previous. "And you, Miss Rose," said the doctor, turning to the young lady. "Oh, very much so indeed," said Rose, interrupting him, "but there is a poor creature upstairs whom aunt wishes you to see." "Ah, to be sure," replied the doctor, "so there is. That was your handiwork, Giles, I understand." Mr. Giles, who had been feverishly putting the teacups to rights, blushed very red and said that he had had that honour. "Honour, eh?" said the doctor. "Well, I don't know. Perhaps it's as honourable to hit a thief in a back kitchen as to hit your man at 12 paces. Fancy that he fired in the air, and you fought a duel, Giles." Mr. Giles, who thought this light treatment of the matter an unjust attempt at diminishing his glory, answered respectfully that it was not for the like of him to judge about that, but he rather thought it was no joke to the opposite party. "Gad, that's true," said the doctor. "Where is he? Shew me the way. I'll look in again as I come down, Mrs. Maylie. That's the little window that he got in at, eh?" "Well, I couldn't have believed it." Talking all the way, he followed Mr. Giles upstairs, and while he is going upstairs, the reader may be informed that Mr. Losberne, a surgeon in the neighbourhood, known through a circuit of 10 miles round as the doctor, had grown fat more from good humour than from good living, and was as kind and hearty, and withal as eccentric an old bachelor, as will be found in 5 times that space by any explorer alive. The doctor was absent much longer than either he or the ladies had anticipated. A large flat box was fetched out of the gig, and a bedroom bell was rung very often, and the servants ran up and down stairs perpetually, from which tokens it was justly concluded that something important was going on above. At length he returned, and in reply to an anxious inquiry after his patient, looked very mysterious, and closed the door carefully. "This is a very extraordinary thing, Mrs. Maylie," said the doctor, standing with his back to the door, as if to keep it shut. "He is not in danger, I hope?" said the old lady. "Why, that would not be an extraordinary thing under the circumstances," replied the doctor, "though I don't think he is. Have you seen this thief?" "No," rejoined the old lady, "nor heard anything about him." "No." "I beg your pardon, ma'am," interposed Mr. Giles, "but I was going to tell you about him when Dr. Losberne came in." The fact was that Mr. Giles had not at first been able to bring his mind to the avowal that he had only shot a boy. Such commendations had been bestowed upon his bravery that he could not, for the life of him, help postponing the explanation for a few delicious minutes, during which he had flourished in the very zenith of a brief reputation for undaunted courage. "Rose wished to see the man," said Mrs. Maylie, "but I wouldn't hear of it." "Humph," rejoined the doctor, "there's nothing very alarming in his appearance. Have you any objection to see him in my presence?" "If it be necessary," replied the old lady, "certainly not." "Then I think it is necessary," said the doctor. "At all events, I am quite sure that you would deeply regret not having done so, if you postponed it. He is perfectly quiet and comfortable now. Allow me, Miss Rose, will you permit me? Not the slightest fear. I pledge you my honour." With many more loquacious assurances that they would be agreeably surprised in the aspect of the criminal, the doctor drew the young lady's arm through one of his, and offering his disengaged hand to Mrs. Maylie, led them, with much ceremony and stateliness, upstairs. "Now," said the doctor in a whisper as he softly turned the handle of a bedroom door, "let us hear what you think of him. He has not been shaved very recently, but he doesn't look at all ferocious notwithstanding. Stop, though, let me see that he is in visiting order first." Stepping before them, he looked into the room, and motioning them to advance, closed the door when they had entered, and gently drew back the curtains of the bed. Upon it, in lieu of the dogged, black-visaged ruffian they had expected to behold, there lay a mere child, worn with pain and exhaustion, and sunk into a deep sleep. His wounded arm, bound and splintered up, was crossed upon his breast, and his head reclined upon the other, which was half hidden by his long hair as it streamed over the pillow. The honest gentleman held the curtain in his hand and looked on for a minute or so in silence. Whilst he was watching the patient thus, the younger lady glided softly past, and seating herself in a chair by the bedside, gathered Oliver's hair from his face, and as she stooped over him, her tears fell upon his forehead. The boy stirred and smiled in his sleep, as though those marks of pity and compassion had awakened some pleasant dream of a love and affection he had never known, as a strain of gentle music, or the rippling of water in a silent place, or the odour of a flower, or even the mention of a familiar word, will sometimes call up sudden dim remembrances of scenes that never were, in this life, which vanish like a breath, and which some brief memory of a happier existence, long gone by, would seem to have awakened, for no power of the human mind can ever recall them. "What can this mean?" exclaimed the elder lady. "This poor child can never have been the pupil of robbers." "Vice," sighed the surgeon, replacing the curtain, "takes up her abode in many temples, and who can say that a fair outside shall not enshrine her?" "But at so early an age," urged Rose. "My dear young lady," rejoined the surgeon, mournfully shaking his head, "crime, like death, is not confined to the old and withered alone. The youngest and fairest are too often its chosen victims." "But can you, oh sir, can you really believe that this delicate boy has been the voluntary associate of the worst outcasts of society?" said Rose anxiously. The surgeon shook his head in a manner which intimated that he feared it was very possible, and observing that they might disturb the patient, led the way into an adjoining apartment. "But even if he has been wicked," pursued Rose, "think how young he is. Think that he may never have known a mother's love, or even the comfort of a home, and that ill usage and blows, or the want of bread, may have driven him to herd with the men who have forced him to guilt. Aunt, dear aunt, for mercy's sake, think of this before you let them drag this sick child to a prison, which in any case must be the grave of all his chances of amendment. Oh, as you love me, and know that I have never felt the want of parents in your goodness and affection, but that I might have done so, and might have been equally helpless and unprotected with this poor child, have pity upon him before it is too late." "My dear love," said the elder lady, as she folded the weeping girl to her bosom, "do you think I would harm a hair of his head?" "Oh no," replied Rose eagerly, "not you, aunt, not you." "No," said the old lady with a trembling lip, "my days are drawing to their close, and may mercy be shewn to me as I shew it to others." "What can I do to save him, sir?" "Let me think, ma'am," said the doctor, "let me think." Mr. Losberne thrust his hands into his pockets and took several turns up and down the room, often stopping and balancing himself on his toes and frowning frightfully. After various exclamations of "I've got it now," and "No, I haven't," and as many renewals of the walking and frowning, he at length made a dead halt and spoke as follows: "I think if you give me a full and unlimited commission to bully Giles, And that little boy, Brittles, I can manage it. He is a faithful fellow and an old servant, I know, but you can make it up to him in 1,000 ways, and reward him for being such a good shot besides. You don't object to that? Unless there is some other way of preserving the child, replied Mrs. Maylie. There is no other, said the doctor. No other, take my word for it. Then aunt invests you with full power, said Rose, smiling through her tears. But pray don't be harder upon the poor fellows than is indispensably necessary. You seem to think, retorted the doctor, that everybody is disposed to be hard-hearted today except yourself. I only hope, for the sake of the rising male sex generally, that you may be found in as vulnerable and soft-hearted a mood by the very first eligible young fellow who appeals to your compassion, and I wish I were a young fellow, that I might avail myself on the spot of such a favourable opportunity for doing so as the present. You are as great a boy as poor Brittles himself, returned Rose, blushing. Well, said the doctor, laughing heartily, that is no very difficult matter. But to return to this boy, the great point of our agreement is yet to come. He will wake in an hour or so, I dare say, and although I have told that thick-headed constable fellow downstairs that he mustn't be moved or spoken to, on peril of his life, I think we may converse with him without danger. Now, I make this stipulation, that I shall examine him in your presence, and that if from what he says we judge, and I can shew to the satisfaction of your cool reason, that he is a real and thorough bad one, which is more than possible, he shall be left to his fate, without any further interference on my part, at all events. Oh no, aunt, entreated Rose. Oh yes, aunt, said the doctor. Is it a bargain? He cannot be hardened in vice, said Rose. It is impossible. Very good, retorted the doctor. Then so much the more reason for acceding to my proposition. Finally, the treaty was entered into, and the parties thereto sat down to wait, with some impatience, until Oliver should awake. The patience of the two ladies was destined to undergo a longer trial than Mr. Losberne had led them to expect, for hour after hour passed on, and still Oliver slumbered heavily. It was evening, indeed, before the kind-hearted doctor brought them the intelligence that he had at length roused sufficiently to be spoken to. The boy was very ill, he said, and weak from the loss of blood, but his mind was so troubled with anxiety to disclose something that he deemed it better to give him the opportunity than to insist upon his remaining quiet until next morning, which he should otherwise have done. The conference was a long one, for Oliver told them all his simple history, and was often compelled to stop by pain and want of strength. It was a solemn thing to hear, in the darkened room, the feeble voice of the sick child recounting a weary catalogue of evils and calamities which hard men had brought upon him. Oh! If when we oppress and grind our fellow creatures, we bestowed but one thought on the dark evidences of human error, which, like dense and heavy clouds, are rising, slowly, it is true, but not less surely, to heaven, to pour their after-vengeance on our heads. If we heard but one instant, in imagination, the deep testimony of dead men's voices, which no power can stifle, and no pride shut out, where would be the injury and injustice, the suffering, misery, cruelty, and wrong that each day's life brings with it? Oliver's pillow was smoothed by woman's hands that night, and loveliness and virtue watched him as he slept. He felt calm and happy, and could have died without a murmur. The momentous interview was no sooner concluded, and Oliver composed to rest again, than the doctor, after wiping his eyes and condemning them for being weak all at once, betook himself downstairs to open upon Mr. Giles. And finding nobody about the parlours, it occurred to him that he could perhaps originate the proceedings with better effect in the kitchen, so into the kitchen he went. There were assembled, in that lower house of the domestic parliament, the women, servants, Mr. Brittles, Mr. Giles, the tinker, who had received a special invitation to regale himself for the remainder of the day in consideration of his services, and the constable. The latter gentleman had a large staff, a large head, large features, and large half-boots, and looked as if he had been taking a proportionate allowance of ale, as indeed he had. The adventures of the previous night were still under discussion, for Mr. Giles was expatiating upon his presence of mind when the doctor entered, and Mr. Brittles, with a mug of ale in his hand, was corroborating everything before his superior said it. "Sit still," said the doctor, waving his hand. "Thank you, sir," said Mr. Giles. "Mrs. wished some ale to be given out, sir, and as I felt no ways inclined for my own little room, sir, and disposed for company, I am taking mine among 'em here." Brittles headed a low murmur by which the ladies and gentlemen generally were understood to express the gratification they derived from Mr. Giles's condescension, and Mr. Giles looked round with a patronising air, as much as to say that so long as they behaved properly, he would never desert them. "How is the patient tonight, sir?" asked Giles. So, returned the doctor. "I am afraid you have got yourself into a scrape there, Mr. Giles." "I hope you don't mean to say, sir," said Mr. Giles, trembling, "that he's going to die. If I thought it, I should never be happy again. I wouldn't cut a boy off, no, not even Brittles here, not for all the plate in the country, sir." "That's not the point," said the doctor mysteriously. "Mr. Giles, are you a Protestant?" "Yes, sir, I hope so," faltered Mr. Giles, who had turned very pale. "And what are you, boy?" said the doctor, turning sharply upon Brittles. "Lord bless me, sir," replied Brittles, starting violently. "I am the same as Mr. Giles, sir." "Then tell me this," said the doctor fiercely. Both of you, are you going to take upon yourselves to swear that that boy upstairs is the boy that was put through the little window last night? Out with it. Come, we are prepared for you." The doctor, who was universally considered one of the best-tempered creatures on earth, made this demand in such a dreadful tone of anger that Giles and Brittles, who were considerably muddled by ale and excitement, stared at each other in a state of stupefaction. "Pay attention to the reply, constable, will you?" said the doctor, shaking his forefinger with great solemnity of manner, and tapping the bridge of his nose with it to bespeak the exercise of that worthy's utmost acuteness. "Something may come of this before long." The constable looked as wise as he could, and took up his staff of office, which had been reclining indolently in the chimney corner. "It's a simple question of identity, you will observe," said the doctor. "That's what it is, sir," replied the constable, coughing with great violence, for he had finished his ale in a hurry, and some of it had gone the wrong way. "Here's a house broken into," said the doctor, "and a couple of men catch one moment's glimpse of a boy in the midst of gunpowder smoke, and in all the distraction of alarm and darkness. Here's a boy comes to that very same house next morning, and because he happens to have his arm tied up, these men lay violent hands upon him, by doing which they place his life in great danger and swear he is the thief. Now, the question is, whether these men are justified by the fact, and if not, what situation do they place themselves in?" The constable nodded profoundly and said that if that wasn't law, he should be glad to know what was. "I ask you again," thundered the doctor, "are you on your solemn oaths able to identify that boy?" Brittles looked doubtfully at Mr. Giles. Mr. Giles looked doubtfully at Brittles. The constable put his hand behind his ear to catch the reply. The two women and the tinker leant forward to listen, and the doctor glanced keenly round when a ring was heard at the gate, and at the same moment the sound of wheels. "It's the runners!" cried Brittles, to all appearance much relieved. "The what?" exclaimed the doctor, aghast in his turn. "The Bow Street officers, sir," replied Brittles, taking up a candle. "Me and Mr. Giles sent for 'em this morning." "What?" cried the doctor. "Yes," replied Brittles. "I sent a message up by the coachman, and I only wonder they weren't here before, sir." "You did you?" "Then confound your slow coaches down here, that's all," said the doctor, walking away. Chapter 30 involves a critical position. "What W.H. that?" inquired Brittles, opening the door a little way, with the chain up and peeping out, shading the candle with his hand. "Open the door," replied a man outside. "It's the officers from Bow Street, as was sent today." Much comforted by this assurance, Brittles opened the door to its full width and confronted a portly man in a great coat, who walked in without saying anything more and wiped his shoes on the mat as coolly as if he lived there. "Just send somebody out to relieve my mate, will you, young man?" said the officer. "He's in the gig minding the prad. Have you got a coaches here that you could put it up in for 5 or 10 minutes? Brittles replying in the affirmative, and pointing out the building, the portly man stepped back to the garden gate and helped his companion to put up the gig, while Brittles lighted them in a state of great admiration. This done, they returned to the house, and, being shown into a parlour, took off their great coats and hats, and showed like what they were. The man who had knocked at the door was a stout personage of middle height, aged about 50, with shiny black hair, cropped pretty close, half whiskers, a round face and sharp eyes. The other was a red-headed bony man, in top boots, with a rather ill-favoured countenance and a turned-up sinister-looking nose. "Tell your governor that Blathers and Duff is here, will you?" said the stouter man, smoothing down his hair and laying a pair of handcuffs on the table. "Oh, good evening, master. Can I have a word or two with you in private, if you please?" This was addressed to Mr. Losberne, who now made his appearance. That gentleman, motioning Brittles to retire, brought in the two ladies and shut the door. "This is the lady of the house," said Mr. Losberne, motioning towards Mrs. Maylie. Mr. Blathers made a bow, and being desired to sit down, put his hat upon the floor, and, taking a chair, motioned Duff to do the same. The latter gentleman, who did not appear quite so much accustomed to good society, or quite so much at his ease in it, one of the two, seated himself, after undergoing several muscular affections of the limbs, and forced the head of his stick into his mouth with some embarrassment. "Now, with regard to this here robbery, master," said Blathers, "what are the circumstances?" Mr. Losberne, who appeared desirous of gaining time, recounted them at great length, and with much circumlocution, Messrs. Blathers and Duff looking very knowing meanwhile, and occasionally exchanging a nod. "I can't say for certain till I see the place, of course," said Blathers, "but my opinion at once is, I don't mind committing myself to that extent, that this wasn't done by a yokel, eh, Duff?" "Certainly not," replied Duff. "And, translating the word yokel for the benefit of the ladies, I apprehend your meaning to be that this attempt was not made by a countryman," said Mr. Losberne with a smile. "That's it, master," replied Blathers. "This is all about the robbery, is it?" "All," replied the doctor. "Now, what is this about this here boy that the servants are talking of?" said Blathers. "Nothing at all," replied the doctor. "One of the frightened servants chose to take it into his head that he had something to do with this attempt to break into the house, but it's nonsense, sheer absurdity." "Very easy disposed of it is," remarked Duff. "What he says is quite correct," observed Blathers, nodding his head in a confirmatory way and playing carelessly with the handcuffs, as if they were a pair of castanets. "Who is the boy? What account does he give of himself? Where did he come from? He didn't drop out of the clouds, did he, master?" "Of course not," replied the doctor, with a nervous glance at the two ladies. "I know his whole history, but we can talk about that presently. You would like to see the place where the thieves made their attempt first, I suppose?" "Certainly," rejoined Mr. Blathers. "We had better inspect the premises first, and examine the servants afterwards. That's the usual way of doing business." Knights were then procured, and Messrs. Blathers and Duff, attended by the native constable, Brittles, Giles, and everybody else in short, went into the little room at the end of the passage and looked out at the window, and afterwards went round by way of the lawn and looked in at the window, and after that had a candle handed out to inspect the shutter with, and after that a lantern to trace the footsteps with, and after that a pitchfork to poke the bushes with. This done, amidst the breathless interest of all beholders, they came in again, and Mr. Giles and Brittles were put through a melodramatic representation of their share in the previous night's adventures, which they performed some 6 times over, contradicting each other in not more than one important respect the first time, and in not more than a dozen the last. This consummation being arrived at, Blathers and Duff cleared the room, and held a long council together, compared with which, for secrecy and solemnity, a consultation of great doctors on the knottiest point in medicine would be mere child's play. Meanwhile, the doctor walked up and down the next room in a very uneasy state, and Mrs. Maylie and Rose looked on with anxious faces. "Upon my word," he said, making a halt, after a great number of very rapid turns, "I hardly know what to do." "Surely," said Rose, "the poor child's story faithfully repeated to these men will be sufficient to exonerate him." "I doubt it, my dear young lady," said the doctor, shaking his head. "I don't think it would exonerate him either with them or with legal functionaries of a higher grade. What is he, after all, they would say? A runaway? Judged by mere world considerations and probabilities, his story is a very doubtful one." "You credit it, surely," interrupted Rose in haste. "I believe it, strange as it is, and perhaps may be an old fool for doing so," rejoined the doctor. "But I don't think it is exactly the tale for a practised police officer, nevertheless." "Why not?" demanded Rose. "Because, my pretty cross-examiner," replied the doctor, "because, viewed with their eyes, there are so many ugly points about it, he can only prove the parts that look bad, and none of those that look well. Confound the fellows, they will have the why and the wherefore, and take nothing for granted. On his own shewing, you see he has been the companion of thieves for some time past. He has been carried to a police office on a charge of picking a gentleman's pocket, and is taken away forcibly from that gentleman's house to a place which he cannot describe or point out, and of the situation of which he has not the remotest idea. He is brought down to Chertsey by men who seem to have taken a violent fancy to him, whether he will or no, and put through a window to rob a house, and then, just at the very moment when he is going to alarm the inmates, and so do the very thing that would set him all to rights, there rushes into the way that blundering dog of a half-bred butler, and shoots him, as if on purpose, to prevent his doing any good for himself. Don't you see all this? I see it, of course, replied Rose, smiling at the doctor's impetuosity, but still I do not see anything in it to criminate the poor child. No, replied the doctor, of course not. Bless the bright eyes of your sex. They never see, whether for good or bad, more than one side of any question, and that is, invariably, the one which first presents itself to them. Having given vent to this result of experience, the doctor put his hands into his pockets and walked up and down the room with even greater rapidity than before. The more I think of it, said the doctor, the more I see that it will occasion endless trouble and difficulty to put these men into possession of the boy's real story. I am certain it will not be believed, and even if they can do nothing to him in the end, still the dragging it forward and giving publicity to all the doubts that will be cast upon it must interfere materially with your benevolent plan of rescuing him from misery. Oh, what is to be done? Cried Rose. Dear, dear, why did they send for these people? Why, indeed, exclaimed Mrs. Maylie, I would not have had them here for the world. All I know is, said Mr. Losberne at last, sitting down with a kind of desperate calmness, that we must try and carry it off with a bold face, that's all. The object is a good one, and that must be the excuse. The boy has strong symptoms of fever upon him, and is in no condition to be talked to any more. That's one comfort. We must make the best of it we can, and if bad is the best, it is no fault of ours. Come in. Well, master, said Blathers, entering the room, followed by his colleague, and making the door fast before he said any more. This warn't a put-up thing. And what the devil's a put-up thing? Demanded the doctor impatiently. We call it a put-up robbery, ladies, said Blathers, turning to them, as if he compassioned their ignorance, but had a contempt for the doctor's, when the servants is in it. Nobody suspected them in this case, said Mrs. Maylie. Very likely not, ma'am, replied Blathers, but they might have been in it for all that. More likely on that very account, said Duff. We find it was a town hand, said Blathers, continuing his report, for the style of work is first-rate. Very pretty indeed it is, remarked Duff in an undertone. There was 2 of 'em in it, continued Blathers, and they had a boy with 'em. That's plain from the size of the window. That's all to be said at present. We'll see this lad that you've got upstairs at once, if you please. Perhaps they will take something to drink first, Mrs. Maylie, said the doctor, his face brightening up as if some new thought had occurred to him. Oh, to be sure, exclaimed Rose eagerly. You shall have it immediately, if you will. Why, thank you, miss, said Blathers, drawing his coat sleeve across his mouth. It's dry work, this sort of duty. Anything that's handy, miss. Don't put yourself out of the way on our accounts. What shall it be? Asked the doctor, following the young lady to the sideboard. A little drop of spirits, master, if it's all the same, replied Blathers. It's a cold ride from London, ma'am, and I always find that spirits comes home warmer to the feelings. This interesting communication was addressed to Mrs. Maylie, who received it very graciously. While it was being conveyed to her, the doctor slipped out of the room. Ah, said Mr. Blathers, not holding his wine-glass by the stem, but grasping the bottom between the thumb and forefinger of his left hand, and placing it in front of his chest. I have seen a good many pieces of business like this in my time, ladies. That cracked down in the back lane at Edmonton, Blathers, said Mr. Duff, assisting his colleague's memory. That was something in this way, warn't it? Rejoined Mr. Blathers. That was done by Conky Chickweed, that was. You always gave that to him, replied Duff. It was the family pet, I tell you, and Conky hadn't any more to do with it than I had. Get out, retorted Mr. Blathers. I know better. Do you mind that time Conky was robbed of his money, though? What a start that was, better than any novel book one ever see. What was that? Inquired Rose, anxious to encourage any symptoms of good humour in the unwelcome visitors. It was a robbery, miss, that hardly anybody would have been down upon, said Blathers. This here Conky Chickweed, Conky means nosy, ma'am, interposed Duff. Of course the lady knows that, don't she? Demanded Mr. Blathers. Always interrupting, you are, partner. This here Conky Chickweed, miss, kept a public house over Battlebridge way, and had a cellar, where a good many young lords went to see cockfighting, and badger-drawing, and that, and a very intellectual manner the sports was conducted in, for I've seen 'em often. He warn't one of the family at that time, and one night he was robbed of 327 guineas in a canvas bag, that was stole out of his bedroom in the dead of night by a tall man with a black patch over his eye who had concealed himself under the bed, and after committing the robbery, jumped slap out of window, which was only a story high. He was very quick about it, but Conky was quick too, for he was woke by the noise, and darting out of bed, fired a blunderbuss after him and roused the neighbourhood. They set up a hue and cry directly, and when they came to look about 'em, found that Conky had hit the robber, for there was traces of blood all the way to some palings a good distance off, and there they lost 'em. However, he had made off with the blunt, and, consequently, the name of Mr. Chickweed, licensed whittler, appeared in the Gazette among the other bankrupts, and all manner of benefits and subscriptions, and I don't know what all, was got up for the poor man, who was in a very low state of mind about his loss, and went up and down the streets for 3 or 4 days, pulling his hair off in such a desperate manner that many people was afraid he might be going to make away with himself. One day he come up to the office all in a hurry, and had a private interview with the magistrate, who, after a good deal of talk, rings the bell and orders Jem Spires in, Jem was active officer, and tells him to go and assist Mr. Chickweed in apprehending the man as robbed his house. "I see him, Spires," said Chickweed, "past my house yesterday morning." "Why didn't you up and collar him?" says Spires. "I was so struck all of a heap that you might have fractured my skull with a toothpick," says the poor man. "But we're sure to have him, for between 10 and 11 o'clock at night he passed again." Spires no sooner heard this than he put some clean linen and a comb in his pocket, in case he should have to stop a day or two, and away he goes, and sets himself down at one of the public-house windows behind a little red curtain with his hat on, all ready to bolt at a moment's notice. He was smoking his pipe here late at night, when all of a sudden Chickweed roars out, "Here he is! Stop thief! Murder!" Jem Spires dashes out, and there he sees Chickweed tearing down the street full cry. Away goes Spires, on keeps Chickweed, round turns the people, everybody roars out, "Thieves!" and Chickweed himself keeps on shouting all the time like mad. Spires loses sight of him a minute as he turns a corner, shoots round, sees a little crowd, dives in. "Which is the man?" "Did me," says Chickweed, "I've lost him again." It was a remarkable occurrence, but he warn't to be seen nowhere, so they went back to the public-house, and next morning Spires took his old place, and looked out from behind the curtain for a tall man with a black patch over his eye, till his own 2 eyes ached again. At last, he couldn't help shutting 'em to ease 'em a minute, and the very moment he did so, he hears Chickweed roaring out, "Here he is!" Off he starts once more, with Chickweed halfway down the street ahead of him, and after twice as long a run as the yesterday's one, the man's lost again. This was done once or twice more, till one half the neighbours gave out that Mr. Chickweed had been robbed by the devil, who was playing tricks with him afterwards, and the other half, that poor Mr. Chickweed had gone mad with grief. "What did Jem Spires say?" inquired the doctor, who had returned to the room shortly after the commencement of the story. "Jem Spires," resumed the officer, "for a long time said nothing at all, and listened to everything without seeming to, which showed he understood his business. But one morning he walked into the bar, and taking out his snuff-box, said, 'Chickweed, I've found out who's done this here robbery.' 'Have you?' said Chickweed. 'Oh, my dear Spires, only let me have vengeance, and I shall die contented. Oh, my dear Spires, where is the villain?' 'Come,' said Spires, offering him a pinch of snuff, 'none of that gammon.' 'You did it yourself.' So he had, and a good bit of money he had made by it too, and nobody would ever have found it out if he hadn't been so precious anxious to keep up appearances. 'That's more,' said Mr. Blathers, putting down his wine-glass and clinking the handcuffs together. 'Very curious indeed,' observed the doctor. 'Now, if you please, you can walk upstairs.' 'If you please, sir,' returned Mr. Blathers, and closely following Mr. Losberne, the 2 officers ascended to Oliver's bedroom, Mr. Giles preceding the party with a lighted candle. Oliver had been dozing, but looked worse, and was more feverish than he had appeared yet. Being assisted by the doctor, he managed to sit up in bed for a minute or so, and looked at the strangers without at all understanding what was going forward, and, in fact, without seeming to recollect where he was, or what had been passing. 'This,' said Mr. Losberne, speaking softly, but with great vehemence notwithstanding, 'this is the lad who, being accidentally wounded by a spring gun in some boyish trespass on Mr. What d'ye call him's grounds, at the back here, comes to the house for assistance this morning, and is immediately laid hold of and maltreated by that ingenious gentleman with the candle in his hand, who has placed his life in considerable danger, as I can professionally certify.'" Messrs. Blathers and Duff looked at Mr. Giles, as he was thus recommended to their notice, and the bewildered butler gazed from them towards Oliver, and from Oliver towards Mr. Losberne, with the most ludicrous mixture of fear and perplexity. "You don't mean to deny that, I suppose?" said the doctor, laying Oliver gently down again. "It was all done for the best, sir," answered Giles. "I am sure I thought it was the boy, or I wouldn't have meddled with him. I am not of an inhuman disposition, sir." "Thought it was what boy?" inquired the senior officer. "The housebreaker's boy, sir," replied Giles. They certainly had a boy." "Well, do you think so now?" inquired Blathers. "Think what now?" replied Giles, looking vacantly at his questioner. "Think it's the same boy, stupid head," rejoined Mr. Blathers impatiently. "I don't know, I really don't know," said Giles with a rueful countenance. "I couldn't swear to him." "What do you think?" asked Mr. Blathers. "I don't know what to think," replied poor Giles. "I don't think it is the boy, indeed. I'm almost certain that it isn't. You know it can't be." "Has this man been a-drinking, sir?" inquired Blathers, turning to the doctor. "What a precious muddle-headed chap you are," said Duff, addressing Mr. Giles with supreme contempt. Mr. Losberne had been feeling the patient's pulse during this short dialogue, but he now rose from the chair by the bedside and remarked that if the officers had any doubts upon the subject, they would perhaps like to step into the next room and have brittles before them. Acting upon this suggestion, they adjourned to a neighbouring apartment, where Mr. Brittles, being called in, involved himself and his respected superior in such a wonderful maze of fresh contradictions and impossibilities as tended to throw no particular light upon anything, save the fact of his own strong mystification, except, indeed, his declarations that he shouldn't know the real boy if he were put before him that instant, that he had only taken Oliver to be he, because Mr. Giles had said he was, and that Mr. Giles had, 5 minutes previously, admitted in the kitchen that he began to be very much afraid he had been a little too hasty. Among other ingenious surmises, the question was then raised whether Mr. Giles had really hit anybody, and upon examination of the fellow pistol to that which he had fired, it turned out to have no more destructive loading than gunpowder and brown paper, a discovery which made a considerable impression on everybody but the doctor, who had drawn the ball about 10 minutes before. Upon no one, however, did it make a greater impression than on Mr. Giles himself, who, after labouring for some hours under the fear of having mortally wounded a fellow creature, eagerly caught at this new idea and favoured it to the utmost. Finally, the officers, without troubling themselves very much about Oliver, left the Chertsey constable in the house, and took up their rest for that night in the town, promising to return next morning. With the next morning there came a rumour that 2 men and a boy were in the cage at Kingston, who had been apprehended overnight under suspicious circumstances, and to Kingston Messrs. Blathers and Duff journeyed accordingly. The suspicious circumstances, however, resolving themselves, on investigation, into the one fact that they had been discovered sleeping under a haystack, which, although a great crime, is only punishable by imprisonment, and is, in the merciful eye of the English law and its comprehensive love of all the king's subjects, held to be no satisfactory proof, in the absence of all other evidence, that the sleeper or sleepers have committed burglary accompanied with violence, and have therefore rendered themselves liable to the punishment of death, Messrs. Blathers and Duff came back again, as wise as they went. In short, after some more examination and a great deal more conversation, a neighbouring magistrate was readily induced to take the joint bail of Mrs. Maylie and Mr. Losberne for Oliver's appearance if he should ever be called upon, and Blathers and Duff, being rewarded with a couple of guineas, returned to town with divided opinions on the subject of their expedition, the latter gentleman, on a mature consideration of all the circumstances, inclining to the belief that the burglarious attempt had originated with the family pet, and the former being equally disposed to concede the full merit of it to the great Mr. Conkey Chickweed. Meanwhile, Oliver gradually throve and prospered under the united care of Mrs. Maylie, Rose, and the kind-hearted Mr. Losberne. If fervent prayers, gushing from hearts overcharged with gratitude, be heard in heaven, and if they be not, what prayers are? The blessings which the orphan child called down upon them sunk into their souls, diffusing peace and happiness. Chapter 31. Oaf th he happy life, Oliver began, T.O. led yith high skind friends. Oliver's ailings were neither slight nor few. In addition to the pain and delay attendant upon a broken limb, his exposure to the wet and cold had brought on fever and ache, which hung about him for many weeks and reduced him sadly. But at length he began, by slow degrees, to get better, and to be able to say sometimes, in a few tearful words, how deeply he felt the goodness of the two sweet ladies, and how ardently he hoped that, when he grew strong and well again, he could do something to show his gratitude. Only something which would let them see the love and duty with which his breast was full, something, however slight, which would prove to them that their gentle kindness had not been cast away, but that the poor boy whom their charity had rescued from misery or death was eager and anxious to serve them with all his heart and soul. "Poor fellow," said Rose, when Oliver had been one day feebly endeavouring to utter the words of thankfulness that rose to his pale lips. "You shall have many opportunities of serving us, if you will. We are going into the country, and my aunt intends that you shall accompany us. The quiet place, the pure air, and all the pleasures and beauties of spring will restore you in a few days, and we will employ you in 100 ways when you can bear the trouble." "The trouble!" cried Oliver. "Oh! Dear lady, if I could but work for you, if I could only give you pleasure by watering your flowers, or watching your birds, or running up and down the whole day long to make you happy, what would I give to do it?" "You shall give nothing at all," said Miss Maylie, smiling, "for, as I told you before, we shall employ you in 100 ways. And if you only take half the trouble to please us that you promise now, you will make me very happy indeed." "Happy, ma'am," cried Oliver. "Oh, how kind of you to say so." "You will make me happier than I can tell you," replied the young lady. "To think that my dear good aunt should have been the means of rescuing anyone from such sad misery as you have described to us, would be an unspeakable pleasure to me. But to know that the object of her goodness and compassion was sincerely grateful, and attached in consequence, would delight me more than you can well imagine. Do you understand me?" she inquired, watching Oliver's thoughtful face. "Oh, yes, ma'am, yes," replied Oliver eagerly, "but I was thinking that I am ungrateful now." "To whom?" inquired the young lady. "To the kind gentleman and the dear old nurse who took so much care of me before," rejoined Oliver. "If they knew how happy I am, they would be pleased, I am sure." "I am sure they would," rejoined Oliver's benefactress, "and Mr. Losberne has already been kind enough to promise that, when you are well enough to bear the journey, he will carry you to see them." "Has he, ma'am?" cried Oliver, his face brightening with pleasure. "I don't know what I shall do for joy when I see their kind faces once again." In a short time, Oliver was sufficiently recovered to undergo the fatigue of this expedition, and one morning he and Mr. Losberne set out accordingly in a little carriage which belonged to Mrs. Maylie. When they came to Chertsey Bridge, Oliver turned very pale and uttered a loud exclamation. "What's the matter with the boy?" cried the doctor, as usual, all in a bustle. "Do you see anything, hear anything, feel anything?" "Eh?" "That, sir," cried Oliver, pointing out of the carriage window. "That house?" "Yes, well, what of it? Stop, coachman, pull up here," cried the doctor. "What of the house, my man, eh?" "The thieves, the house they took me to," whispered Oliver. "The devil it is!" cried the doctor. "Halloa there! Let me out!" But before the coachman could dismount from his box, he had tumbled out of the coach by some means or other, and, running down to the deserted tenement, began kicking at the door like a madman. "Halloa!" said a little, ugly, hump-backed man, opening the door so suddenly that the doctor, from the very impetus of his last kick, nearly fell forward into the passage. "What's the matter here?" "Matter!" exclaimed the other, collaring him, without a moment's reflection. "A good deal. Robbery is the matter." "There'll be murder too," replied the hump-backed man coolly, "if you don't take your hands off." "Do you hear me?" "I hear you," said the doctor, giving his captive a hearty shake. "Where's, confound the fellow, what's his rascally name? Sykes. That's it. Where's Sykes, you thief?" The hump-backed man stared as if in excess of amazement and indignation, and twisting himself dexterously from the doctor's grasp, growled forth a volley of horrid oaths and retired into the house. Before he could shut the door, however, the doctor had passed into the parlour without a word of parley. He looked anxiously round. Not an article of furniture, not a vestige of anything, animate or inanimate, not even the position of the cupboards, answered Oliver's description. "Now," said the humpbacked man, who had watched him keenly, "what do you mean by coming into my house in this violent way? Do you want to rob me, or to murder me? Which is it? Did you ever know a man come out to do either in a chariot and pair, you ridiculous old vampire?" said the irritable doctor. "What do you want, then?" demanded the hunchback fiercely. "Will you take yourself off before I do you a mischief?" "To curse you, as soon as I think proper," said Mr. Losberne, looking into the other parlour, which, like the first, bore no resemblance whatever to Oliver's account of it. "I shall find you out some day, my friend." "Will you?" sneered the ill-favoured cripple. "If you ever want me, I'm here. I haven't lived here mad and all alone for 25 years to be scared by you. You shall pay for this, you shall pay for this." And so saying, the misshapen little demon set up a hideous yell and danced upon the ground as if frantic with rage. "Stupid enough, this," muttered the doctor to himself. "The boy must have made a mistake. There, put that in your pocket and shut yourself up again." With these words he flung the hunchback a piece of money and returned to the carriage. A man followed to the chariot door, uttering the wildest imprecations and curses all the way. But as Mr. Losberne turned to speak to the driver, he looked into the carriage and eyed Oliver for an instant with a glance so sharp and fierce, and at the same time so furious and vindictive, that, waking or sleeping, he could not forget it for months afterwards. He continued to utter the most fearful imprecations until the driver had resumed his seat, and when they were once more on their way, they could see him some distance behind, beating his feet upon the ground and tearing his hair in transports of frenzied rage. "I am an ass," said the doctor, after a long silence. "Did you know that before, Oliver?" "No, sir." "Then don't forget it another time." "An ass," said the doctor again, after a further silence of some minutes. "Even if it had been the right place, and the right fellows had been there, what could I have done single-handed? And if I had had assistance, I see no good that I should have done, except leading to my own exposure and an unavoidable statement of the manner in which I have hushed up this business. That would have served me right, though. I am always involving myself in some scrape or other by acting upon these impulses, and it might have done me good." Now, the fact was that the excellent doctor had never acted upon anything else but impulse all through his life, and it was no bad compliment to the nature of the impulses which governed him, that so far from being involved in any peculiar troubles or misfortunes, he had the warmest respect and esteem of all who knew him. If the truth must be told, he was a little out of temper for a minute or two at being disappointed in procuring corroborative evidence of Oliver's story on the very first occasion on which he had a chance of obtaining any. He soon came round again, however, and finding that Oliver's replies to his questions were still as straightforward and consistent, and still delivered with as much apparent sincerity and truth as they had ever been, he made up his mind to attach full credence to them from that time forth. As Oliver knew the name of the street in which Mr. Brownlow resided, they were enabled to drive straight thither. When the coach turned into it, his heart beat so violently that he could scarcely draw his breath. "Now, my boy, which house is it?" inquired Mr. Losberne. That," replied Oliver, pointing eagerly out of the window. "The White House! Oh, make haste! Pray make haste! I feel as if I should die, it makes me tremble so." "Come, come," said the good doctor, patting him on the shoulder. "You will see them directly, and they will be overjoyed to find you safe and well." "Oh, I hope so," cried Oliver. "They were so good to me, so very, very good to me, sir." A coach rolled on. It stopped. No, that was the wrong house. The next door. It went on a few paces and stopped again. Oliver looked up at the windows with tears of happy expectation coursing down his face. Alas! The White House was empty, and there was a bill in the window, "To let." "Knock at the next door," cried Mr. Losberne, taking Oliver's arm in his. "What has become of Mr. Brownlow, who used to live in the adjoining house, do you know?" The servant did not know, but would go and inquire. She presently returned and said that Mr. Brownlow had sold off his goods and gone to the West Indies 6 weeks before. Oliver clasped his hands and sank feebly backwards. "Has his housekeeper gone too?" inquired Mr. Losberne, after a moment's pause. "Yes, sir," replied the servant. "The old gentleman, the housekeeper, and a gentleman, a friend of Mr. Brownlow's, all went together." "Then turn towards home again," said Mr. Losberne to the driver, "and don't stop to bait the horses till you get out of this confounded London." "The bookstall keeper, sir?" said Oliver. "I know the way there. See him, pray, sir, do see him." "My poor boy, this is disappointment enough for one day," said the doctor. "Quite enough for both of us. If we go to the bookstall keeper's, we shall certainly find that he is dead, or has set his house on fire, or run away. No, home again straight." And in obedience to the doctor's first impulse, home they went. This bitter disappointment caused Oliver much sorrow and grief, even in the midst of his happiness, for he had pleased himself many times during his illness with thinking of all that Mr. Brownlow and Mrs. Bedwin would say to him. and what delight it would be to tell them how many long days and nights he had passed in reflecting upon what they had done for him, and in bewailing his cruel separation from them. A hope of eventually clearing himself with them too, and explaining how he had been forced away, had buoyed him up and sustained him under many of his recent trials. And now the idea that they should have gone so far, and carried with them the belief that he was an impostor and a robber, a belief which might remain uncontradicted to his dying day, was almost more than he could bear. The circumstance occasioned no alteration, however, in the behaviour of his benefactors. After another fortnight, when the fine warm weather had fairly begun, and every tree and flower was putting forth its young leaves and rich blossoms, they made preparations for quitting the house at Chertsey for some months. Sending the plate which had so excited the Jew's cupidity to the bankers, and leaving Giles and another servant in care of the house, they departed for a cottage some distance in the country and took Oliver with them. Who can describe the pleasure and delight, the peace of mind and soft tranquillity which the sickly boy felt in the balmy air and among the green hills and rich woods of an inland village? Who can tell how scenes of peace and quietude sink into the minds of pain-worn dwellers in close and noisy places, and carry their own freshness deep into their jaded hearts? Men who have lived in crowded, pent-up streets through whole lives of toil, and never wished for change, men to whom custom has indeed been second nature, and who have come almost to love each brick and stone that form the narrow boundaries of their daily walks. Even they, with the hand of death upon them, have been known to yearn at last for one short glimpse of nature's face, and carried far from the scenes of their old pains and pleasures, have seemed to pass at once into a new state of being, and crawling forth from day to some green sunny spot, have had such memories wakened up within them by the mere sight of sky, and hill, and plain, and glistening water, that a foretaste of heaven itself has soothed their quick decline, and they have sunk into their tombs as peacefully as the sun, whose setting they watched from their lonely chamber window but a few hours before, faded from their dim and feeble sight. The memories which peaceful country scenes call up are not of this world, or of its thoughts or hopes. Their gentle influence may teach us to weave fresh garlands for the graves of those we loved, may purify our thoughts and bear down before it old enmity and hatred. But beneath all this there lingers in the least reflective mind a vague and half-formed consciousness of having held such feelings long before in some remote and distant time, which calls up solemn thoughts of distant times to come, and bends down pride and worldliness beneath it. It was a lovely spot to which they repaired, and Oliver, whose days had been spent among squalid crowds and in the midst of noise and brawling, seemed to enter upon a new existence there. The rose and honeysuckle clung to the cottage walls, the ivy crept round the trunks of the trees, and the garden flowers perfumed the air with delicious odours. Hard by was a little churchyard, not crowded with tall, unsightly gravestones, but full of humble mounds covered with fresh turf and moss, beneath which the old people of the village lay at rest. Oliver often wandered here, and thinking of the wretched grave in which his mother lay, would sometimes sit him down and sob unseen. But, as he raised his eyes to the deep sky overhead, he would cease to think of her as lying in the ground, and weep for her sadly, but without pain. It was a happy time. The days were peaceful and serene, and the nights brought with them no fear or care, no languishing in a wretched prison, or associating with wretched men, nothing but pleasant and happy thoughts. Every morning he went to a white-headed old gentleman, who lived near the little church, who taught him to read better and to write, and spoke so kindly and took such pains that Oliver could never try enough to please him. Then he would walk with Mrs. Maylie and Rose, and hear them talk of books, or perhaps sit near them in some shady place and listen whilst the young lady read, which he could have done till it grew too dark to see the letters. Then he had his own lesson for the next day to prepare, and at this he would work hard, in a little room which looked into the garden, till evening came slowly on, when the ladies would walk out again, and he with them, listening with such pleasure to all they said, and so happy if they wanted a flower that he could climb to reach, or had forgotten anything he could run to fetch, that he could never be quick enough about it. When it became quite dark, and they returned home, the young lady would sit down to the piano and play some melancholy air, or sing, in a low and gentle voice, some old song which it pleased her aunt to hear. There would be no candles at such times as these, and Oliver would sit by one of the windows, listening to the sweet music, while tears of tranquil joy stole down his face. And when Sunday came, how differently the day was spent from any manner in which he had ever spent it yet, and how happily, too, like all the other days in that most happy time. There was the little church in the morning, with the green leaves fluttering at the windows, the birds singing without, and the sweet-smelling air stealing in at the low porch and filling the homely building with its fragrance. And the poor people were so neat and clean, and knelt so reverently in prayer, that it seemed a pleasure, not a tedious duty, their assembling there together. And though the singing might be rude, it was real, and sounded more musical, to Oliver's ears at least, than any he had ever heard in church before. Then there were the walks as usual, and many calls at the clean houses of the labouring men, and at night Oliver read a chapter or two from the Bible, which he had been studying all the week, and in the performance of which duty he felt more proud and pleased than if he had been the clergyman himself. In the morning Oliver would be, afoot by 6 o'clock, roaming the fields and surveying the hedges, far and wide, for nosegays of wild flowers, with which he would return laden home, and which it took great care and consideration to arrange, to the best advantage, for the embellishment of the breakfast table. There was fresh groundsel, too, for Miss Maylie's birds, with which Oliver, who had been studying the subject under the able tuition of the village clerk, would decorate the cages in the most approved taste. When the birds were made all spruce and smart for the day, there was usually some little commission of charity to execute in the village, or, failing that, there was always something to do in the garden, or about the plants, to which Oliver, who had studied this science also under the same master, who was a gardener by trade, applied himself with hearty goodwill till Miss Rose made her appearance, when there were 1,000 commendations to be bestowed upon all he had done, for which one of those light-hearted, beautiful smiles was an ample recompense. So 3 months glided away, 3 months which, in the life of the most blessed and favoured of mortals, would have been unmixed happiness, but which, in Oliver's troubled and clouded dawn, were felicity indeed. With the purest and most amiable generosity on one side, and the truest and warmest and most soul-felt gratitude on the other, it is no wonder that, by the end of that short time, Oliver Twist had become completely domesticated with the old lady and her niece, and that the fervent attachment of his young and sensitive heart was repaid by their pride in, and attachment to, himself. Chapter 32. Wherein T.H.E. Happiness, O.F. Oliver A.N.D.H.I.'s friends, experiences a sudden check. Spring flew swiftly by, and summer came, and if the village had been beautiful at first, it was now in the full glow and luxuriance of its richness. The great trees, which had looked shrunken and bare in the earlier months, had now burst into strong life and health, and stretching forth their green arms over the thirsty ground, converted open and naked spots into choice nooks, where was a deep and pleasant shade from which to look upon the wide prospect, steeped in sunshine, which lay stretched out beyond. The earth had donned her mantle of brightest green, and shed her richest perfumes abroad. It was the prime and vigour of the year, and all things were glad and flourishing. Still the same quiet life went on at the little cottage, and the same cheerful serenity prevailed among its inmates. Oliver had long since grown stout and healthy, but health or sickness made no difference in his warm feelings to those about him, though they do in the feelings of a great many people, and he was still the same gentle, attached, affectionate creature that he had been when pain and suffering had wasted his strength, and he was dependent for every slight attention and comfort on those who tended him. One beautiful night they had taken a longer walk than was customary with them, for the day had been unusually warm, and there was a brilliant moon, and a light wind had sprung up, which was unusually refreshing. Rose had been in high spirits too, and they had walked on, in merry conversation, until they had far exceeded their ordinary bounds. Mrs. Maylie was fatigued, and they returned more slowly home. The young lady, merely throwing off her simple bonnet, sat down to the piano as usual. After running abstractedly over the keys for a few minutes, she fell into a low and very solemn air, and as she played it, they heard her sob as if she were weeping. "Rose, my dear?" said the elder lady. Rose made no reply, but played a little quicker, as though the sound had roused her from some painful thoughts. "Rose, my love," cried Mrs. Maylie, rising hastily and bending over her. "What is this? Your face is bathed in tears. My dear child, what distresses you?" "Nothing, aunt, nothing," replied the young lady. "I don't know what it is, I can't describe it, but I feel so low tonight, and—" "Not ill, my love," interposed Mrs. Maylie. "No, no, oh, not ill," replied Rose, shuddering, as though some deadly chillness were passing over her while she spoke. "At least, I shall be better presently." "Close the window, pray." Oliver hastened to comply with the request, and the young lady, making an effort to recover her cheerfulness, strove to play some livelier tune, but her fingers dropped powerless on the keys, and covering her face with her hands, she sank upon a sofa and gave vent to the tears which she was now unable to repress. "My child," said the elder lady, folding her arms about her, "I never saw you thus before." "I would not alarm you if I could avoid it," rejoined Rose, "but indeed I have tried very hard, and cannot help this. I fear I am ill, aunt." She was, indeed, for, when candles were brought, they saw that in the very short time which had elapsed since their return home, the hue of her countenance had changed to a marble whiteness. Its expression had lost nothing of its beauty, but yet it was changed, and there was an anxious, haggard look about that gentle face which it had never worn before. Another minute, and it was suffused with a crimson flush, and a heavy wildness came over the soft blue eye. Again, this disappeared, like the shadow thrown by a passing cloud, and she was once more deadly pale. Oliver, who watched the old lady anxiously, observed that she was alarmed by these appearances, and so in truth was he. But seeing that she affected to make light of them, he endeavoured to do the same, and they so far succeeded that when Rose was persuaded by her aunt to retire for the night, she was in better spirits, and appeared even in better health, and assured them that she felt certain she should wake in the morning quite well. "I hope, ma'am," said Oliver, when Mrs. Maylie returned, "that nothing serious is the matter? Miss Maylie doesn't look well tonight, but—" The old lady motioned him not to speak, and sitting herself down in a dark corner of the room, remained silent for some time. At length she said in a trembling voice, "I hope not, Oliver. I have been very happy with her for some years, too happy perhaps, and it may be time that I should meet with some misfortune, but I hope it is not this." "What misfortune, ma'am?" inquired Oliver. "The heavy blow," said the old lady, almost inarticulately, "of losing the dear girl who has so long been my comfort and happiness." "Oh, God forbid!" exclaimed Oliver hastily. "Amen to that, my child," said the old lady, wringing her hands. "Surely there is no danger of anything so dreadful," said Oliver. "2 hours ago she was quite well." "She is very ill now," rejoined Mrs. Maylie, "and will be worse, I am sure. My dear, dear Rose." "Oh, what should I do without her?" The lady sank beneath her desponding thoughts, and gave way to such great grief that Oliver, suppressing his own emotion, ventured to remonstrate with her, and to beg earnestly that, for the sake of the dear young lady herself, she would be more calm. "And consider, ma'am," said Oliver, as the tears forced themselves into his eyes, despite his efforts to the contrary. "Oh, consider how young and good she is, and what pleasure and comfort she gives to all about her. I am sure, certain, quite certain, that for your sake, who are so good yourself, and for her own, and for the sake of all she makes so happy, she will not die. God will never let her die yet." "Hush," said Mrs. Maylie, laying her hand on Oliver's head. "You think like a child, poor boy, and although what you say may be natural, it is wrong. But you teach me my duty, notwithstanding. I had forgotten it for a moment, Oliver, and I hope I may be pardoned. For I am old, and have seen enough of illness and death to know the pain they leave to those behind. I have seen enough, too, to know that it is not always the youngest and best who are spared to those that love them. But this should give us comfort rather than sorrow, for heaven is just, and such things teach us impressively that there is a far brighter world than this, and that the passage to it is speedy. God's will be done. But I love her, and He alone knows how well." Oliver was surprised to see that as Mrs. Maylie said these words, she checked her lamentations as though by one struggle, and drawing herself up as she spoke, became quite composed and firm. He was still more astonished to find that this firmness lasted, and that, under all the care and watching which ensued, Mrs. Maylie was ever ready and collected, performing all the duties which devolved upon her steadily, and, to all external appearance, even cheerfully. But he was young, and did not know what strong minds are capable of under trying circumstances. How should he, indeed, when their possessors so seldom know themselves? An anxious night ensued, and when morning came, Mrs. Maylie's predictions were but too well verified. Rose was in the first stage of a high and dangerous fever. "We must be active, Oliver, and not give way to useless grief," said Mrs. Maylie, laying her finger on her lip as she looked steadily into his face. "This letter must be sent, with all possible expedition, to Mr. Losberne. It must be carried to the market town, which is not more than 4 miles off, by the footpath across the fields, and thence dispatched by an express on horseback straight to Chertsey. The people at the inn will undertake to do this, and I can trust you to see it done, I know." Oliver could make no reply, but looked his anxiety to be gone at once. "Here is another letter," said Mrs. Maylie, pausing to reflect, "but whether to send it now, or wait until I see how Rose goes on, I scarcely know. I would not forward it unless I feared the worst." "Is it for Chertsey too, ma'am?" inquired Oliver, impatient to execute his commission, and holding out his trembling hand for the letter. "No," replied the old lady, giving it him mechanically. Oliver glanced at it, and saw that it was directed to Harry Maylie, Esquire, at some lord's house in the country, where he could not make out. "Shall it go, ma'am?" asked Oliver, looking up impatiently. "I think not," replied Mrs. Maylie, taking it back. "I will wait till tomorrow." With these words she gave Oliver her purse, and he started off without more delay at the greatest speed he could muster. Swiftly he ran across the fields, and down the little lanes which sometimes divided them, now almost hidden by the high corn on either side, and now emerging into an open field, where the mowers and haymakers were busy at their work, nor did he stop once save now and then for a few seconds to recover breath until he emerged, in a great heat and covered with dust, on the little market-place of the market-town. Here he paused and looked about for the inn. There was a white bank, and a red brewery, and a yellow town hall, and in one corner a large house, with all the wood about it painted green, before which was the sign of the George, to which he hastened directly it caught his eye. Oliver spoke to a post-boy who was dozing under the gateway, and who, after hearing what he wanted, referred him to the hostler, who, after hearing all he had to say again, referred him to the landlord, who was a tall gentleman in a blue neckcloth, a white hat, drab breeches, and boots with tops to match, and was leaning against a pump by the stable door, picking his teeth with a silver toothpick. This gentleman walked with much deliberation to the bar to make out the bill, which took a long time making out, and after it was ready, and paid, a horse had to be saddled, and a man to be dressed, which took up 10 good minutes more. Meanwhile, Oliver was in such a desperate state of impatience and anxiety that he felt as if he could have jumped upon the horse himself, and galloped away full tier to the next stage. At length all was ready, and the little parcel having been handed up, with many injunctions and entreaties for its speedy delivery, the man set spurs to his horse, and rattling over the uneven paving of the market-place, was out of the town, and galloping along the turnpike road in a couple of minutes. It was something to feel certain that assistance was sent for, and that no time had been lost. Oliver hurried up the inn-yard with a somewhat lighter heart, and was turning out of the gateway when he accidentally stumbled against a tall man, wrapped in a cloak, who was that moment coming out at the inn door. "Ha!" cried the man, fixing his eyes on Oliver and suddenly recoiling. "What the devil's this?" "I beg your pardon, sir," said Oliver. "I was in a great hurry to get home, and didn't see you were coming." "Death," muttered the man to himself, glaring at the boy with his large dark eyes. "Who'd have thought it? Grind him to ashes. He'd start up from a marble coffin to come in my way." "I am sorry, sir," stammered Oliver, confused by the strange man's wild look. "I hope I have not hurt you. Rot his bones," murmured the man in a horrible passion between his clenched teeth. "If I had only had the courage to say the word, I might have been free of him in a night. Curses light upon your head, and black death upon your heart, you imp." "What are you doing here?" The man shook his fist and gnashed his teeth as he uttered these words incoherently, and advancing towards Oliver, as if with the intention of aiming a blow at him, fell violently on the ground, writhing and foaming in a fit. Oliver gazed for a moment at the fearful struggles of the madman, for such he supposed him to be, and then darted into the house for help. Having seen him safely carried into the hotel, he turned his face homewards, running as fast as he could to make up for lost time, and recalling, with a great deal of astonishment and some fear, the extraordinary behaviour of the person from whom he had just parted. The circumstance did not dwell in his recollection long, however, for when he reached the cottage there was enough to occupy his mind, and to drive all considerations of self completely from his memory. Rose Maylie had rapidly grown worse, and before midnight was delirious. A medical practitioner, who resided on the spot, was in constant attendance upon her, and after first seeing the patient, he had taken Mrs. Maylie aside, and pronounced her disorder to be one of a most alarming nature. In fact, he said, it would be little short of a miracle if she recovered. How often did Oliver start from his bed that night, and stealing out, with noiseless footstep, to the staircase, listen for the slightest sound from the sick chamber. How often did a tremble shake his frame, and cold drops of terror start upon his brow, when a sudden trampling of feet caused him to fear that something too dreadful to think of had even then occurred. And what had been the fervency of all the prayers he had ever uttered, compared with those he poured forth now, in the agony and passion of his supplication, for the life and health of the gentle creature who was tottering on the deep grave's verge? The suspense, the fearful, acute suspense, of standing idly by while the life of one we dearly love is trembling in the balance. The racking thoughts that crowd upon the mind and make the heart beat violently and the breath come thick by the force of the images they conjure up before it. The desperate anxiety to be doing something to relieve the pain or lessen the danger which we have no power to alleviate. And the sinking of soul and spirit, which the sad remembrance of our helplessness produces. What tortures can equal these, and what reflections or efforts can, in the full tide and fever of the time, allay them? Morning came, and the little cottage was lonely and still. People spoke in whispers. Anxious faces appeared at the gate from time to time, and women and children went away in tears. All the livelong day, and for hours after it had grown dark, Oliver paced softly up and down the garden, raising his eyes every instant to the sick chamber, and shuddering to see the darkened window looking as if death lay stretched inside. Late at night Mr. Losberne arrived. "It is hard," said the good doctor, turning away as he spoke, "so young, so much beloved, but there is very little hope." Another morning, the sun shone brightly as if it looked upon no misery or care, and, with every leaf and flower in full bloom about her, with life and health and sounds and sights of joy surrounding her on every side, the fair young creature lay wasting fast. Oliver crept away to the old churchyard, and sitting down on one of the green mounds, wept for her in silence. There was such peace and beauty in the scene, so much of brightness and mirth in the sunny landscape, such blithesome music in the songs of the summer birds, such freedom in the rapid flight of the rook, careering overhead, so much of life and joyousness in all, that when the boy raised his aching eyes and looked about, the thought instinctively occurred to him that this was not a time for death, that Rose could surely never die when humbler things were all so glad and gay, that graves were for cold and cheerless winter, not for sunlight and fragrance. He almost thought that shrouds were for the old and shrunken, and never wrapped the young and graceful form within their ghastly folds. A knell from the church bell broke harshly on these youthful thoughts. Another, again. It was tolling for the funeral service. A group of humble mourners entered the gate, and they wore white favours, for the corpse was young. They stood uncovered by a grave, and there was a mother once, among the weeping train. But the sun shone brightly, and the birds sang on. Oliver turned homewards, thinking on the many kindnesses he had received from the young lady, and wishing that the time could come over again, that he might never cease showing her how grateful and attached he was. He had no cause for self-reproach on the score of neglect or want of thought, for he had been devoted to her service, and yet 100 little occasions rose up before him on which he fancied he might have been more zealous and more earnest, and wished he had been. We need be careful how we deal with those about us, for every death carries with it to some small circle of survivors thoughts of so much omitted and so little done, of so many things forgotten and so many more which might have been repaired, that such recollections are among the bitterest we can have. There is no remorse so deep as that which is unavailing. If we would be spared its tortures, let us remember this in time. When he reached home, Mrs. Maylie was sitting in the little parlour. Oliver's heart sank at sight of her, for she had never left the bedside of her niece, and he trembled to think what change could have driven her away. He learnt that she had fallen into a deep sleep, from which she would waken either to recovery and life, or to bid them farewell and die. They sat, listening and afraid to speak, for hours. The untasted meal was removed, and with looks which showed that their thoughts were elsewhere, they watched the sun as he sank lower and lower, and at length cast over sky and earth those brilliant hues which herald his departure. Their quick ears caught the sound of an approaching footstep, and they both involuntarily darted towards the door as Mr. Losberne entered. "What of Rose?" cried the old lady. "Tell me at once. I can bear it, anything but suspense. Oh, tell me, in the name of heaven." "You must compose yourself," said the doctor, supporting her. "Be calm, my dear ma'am, pray." "Let me go, in God's name," gasped Mrs. Maylie. "My dear child." "She is dead. She is dying." "No," cried the doctor passionately. "As he is good and merciful, she will live to bless us all for years to come." The lady fell upon her knees and tried to fold her hands together, but the energy which had supported her so long fled to heaven with her first thanksgiving, and she sank back into the friendly arms which were extended to receive her.